I'm going to share my screen real quick and point everyone to a resource that we will be sure that you'll be able to access. If you want to shoot the QR code, you can right now. And this will be a rolling or unfolding log of all the resources and the things that everyone points to today. And so we'll make sure that you have this QR code and you have this URL accessible to you through the Q&A pod and through the chat pod. And everything that the folks mention on this in this event will be cataloged there for you, so you can easily reference it. And so this is the back to school episode, and obviously one of the biggest events and focal points for back to school and higher education in 2023 is the advent of artificial intelligence. As most of you know, ChatGPT became available for widespread use, and our students started using it in November of 2022. And so this is the first moment we really had the occasion to have some conversations and some planning about positioning our campuses and our programs and our curricula and our syllabi to respond to the new and emerging realities. And so please welcome to the cafe today 4 guests. Dr. Wanda White, who's the director of the Center for Innovation and Transformative Instruction at Winston-Salem State University, who's also an Adobe digital literacy thought leader. Daniel Anderson, my colleague, professor of English and the director of the first year writing program at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I used to be a full-time faculty member. And Susan Miller-Cochran, who is the executive director of general education and a professor at the University of Arizona, and Bill Hart-Davidson, associate dean of research and graduate education and professor at Michigan State University. And so this resource, as I said earlier, will be unfolding. I'll be constantly adding resources and links to this. What we're going to do is we're going to go around the horn real quickly, and we're going to ask everyone to kind of introduce themselves and just say a little bit more about the work they do and the background they're coming from. This collection of panelists all have a background in English education and specifically writing programs and the teaching of writing, but they also have different emphases and focal points. Wanda is the director of a Center for Innovative Instruction. Susan Miller-Cochran, as we just talked about, is a dean overseeing general education curriculum. Dan is currently directing a writing program, and Bill is an associate dean for graduate education and research. And so each of them are going to look at this issue from those particular inflection points and through those frameworks. But we'll just go around the horn real quickly. And Wanda, if you'll introduce yourself, give a little bit of background of what you do at Winston-Salem State University, and tell us just in 30 seconds or less how your conversations about producing a statement on the use of AI in the curriculum have emerged on your campus, and then we'll dive deeper into where those things are after we go around the horn real quickly once. So Wanda, if you'd introduce yourself first.
Good morning, everyone. I am Wanda White Walker, and I'm at Winston-Salem State University. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning, which is in our Center for Innovative and Transformative Instruction. It's also a faculty development center. It is also our online teaching instruction support hub. So we do a lot of things in city, as we call it. Our discussion about AI began soon after November 2022. The holidays hit, so we didn't hear anything. But when we came back from the holidays last spring, we had a ton of emails and calls from faculty asking about, specifically ChatGPT and then generative AI, and how we can stop it is what we got most. And then, of course, what is it? So immediately we began knowing that faculty development would play a big part in bringing that to campus, as well as sharing and alleviating fears, but as well as looking at all of the parameters around generative AI. So around mid-spring, we had a quick lunch and learn where we worked with the HBC Faculty Development Network And that kind of catapulted our discussion about what we can do over the summer to create an informal statement.
Awesome. Dan, please, your turn.
Yes, I got exposed to AI 2 years ago. As a writing program director, I had an instructor come to me with a case of suspected plagiarism because the quality of the writing had shifted dramatically in an essay. And we consulted, and I recommended some conversation among the instructor and the student. And the instructor came back to me the next week and said, I've sorted it out. The student used Grammarly. And that was long before ChatGPT. Suddenly there was concern that there was computer help that was fixing the writing of this one particular student. So as Todd and Bill and everyone knows, I'm interested in the intersection of writing and computers. So this is the kind of stage that we're at with that trajectory of how computers have reshaped writing over the last several decades. I'd like to talk more about that at some point, but that's kind of where I'm at. On my campus, the provost initiated work to deliver guidelines related for AI for students. So I've been participating in those, and then I've developed guidelines for our program that are specific to writing courses.
Excellent. Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Miller-Cochran. I'm at the University of Arizona, as Todd mentioned, and I'm the Executive Director of General Education here. And I've been in that role for about 4 years. I guess I'm the inaugural person in that role. No one was really in charge of general education here before, which might be surprising at such a large school. But part of my task was redesigning general education. So we have just launched a new gen ed program right around the time that all of this conversation with AI started to become a big part of what we were discussing in higher education too. Before that, and I think this context is maybe helpful, I was the director of the writing program. And so that's kind of my background as well. And I directed the writing program at North Carolina State University as well before that. So I know part of how I'm thinking about this does still come from that writing studies perspective, but I've had to think a little bit more about how AI impacts what we're doing in teaching and learning in courses across the curriculum as part of general education, and to think about that beyond just the writing perspective, how it impacts what students are doing in writing, and try to anticipate what this might look like as we go into the future. On our campus, there have been many different initiatives that have begun as part of addressing AI. A lot of this sprung up over the summer when people are doing various things and some people aren't on campus. And so there was a very large group of faculty and some administrators who met regularly over the summer and have put together a really nice resource, a website on artificial intelligence at U of A. But then there also are some guidelines that have been published by our it's the University Center for Assessment, Teaching, and Technology. It's basically our Center for Teaching and Learning. They put together some beautiful guidelines for teachers to think about teaching and learning with AI. And then our Writing Across the Curriculum program, which we launched as part of our general education curriculum design, also has put together some guidelines specifically related to writing. And how to, and they were kind of the leaders in that. Their statement came out in the spring before a lot of these other resources started to emerge. So there have been a lot of different things going on. And I think now at the beginning of the fall, we're trying to figure out how to bring all of that together and communicate something that's more cohesive to faculty so they know how to address AI appropriately and how to use it productively in discussions in the classroom.
Excellent. Thank you. Bill.
Yeah, I'm Bill Hart-Davidson. I'm at Michigan State, and in my role, I help folks think about their faculty careers as researchers and scholars and artists, and also help the graduate programs who are really training, I guess, the next generation of people who will do that kind of work, whether they're doing it in the academy and out. And in that regard, what I might bring to this conversation is all the ways that AI might affect our work in our research lives, in our business practice lives, as faculty members, apart from the classroom, in addition to the classroom. And there's some interesting dynamics that have gone on there. Our initial response to answer Todd's question was much like what Wanda described at her campus. Shortly after November, people were like, okay, we can't do anything until the holidays are over. And then in January, we quickly got a meeting together, and we divided the group into 3 different working groups that have persisted. And one is more or less on guidelines and policy, academic integrity issues. One is on pedagogy. That's the biggest and perhaps the most active group initially, because teachers needed that guidance. And like on Susan's campus, it's been centered in our Center for Teaching and Learning. And then the third group is the one that I joined by my role, and that is, what are the impacts on research activity and guidance and strategy around that? And they cover everything from can we use this in by license terms in our research project now, to what does it do if are we exposing private research data in violation of our IRB agreements if we use it in a research project? All kinds of really interesting wrinkles that arise from that area.
And so multifaceted and complex, which is why it's so important to get together and compare notes. And we should probably do this, if not every year for the upcoming future, but maybe every other month, because it's changing so quickly. And so as we go around again, do your best to sort of describe what consensus or stasis you've kind of gotten to at the moment, knowing that it's going to continue to change and evolve. What are the, Susan, you just mentioned 3 or 4 different, documents and statements to try to sort of summarize what each of those do. And for those who are asking and wondering, who may be logged in late, we have a resource, a web page, and we'll be sure at the end, make sure everyone has that URL, where we're gonna be putting links to everything that everyone is referencing. So you'll be able to get copies of everything they're talking about and read and learn from that as well. So just in a couple of minutes, where are you now? What statements do you have that have been sort of circulated, and what's the consensus that's located in those materials? We'll just go into say more to Wanda. Where's Winston-Salem State at the moment?
So currently, as I mentioned, over the summer, our center gathered to start collecting research articles, attending webinars. And surprisingly, we saw a lot of the webinars were supported by places like Grammarly and, the corporations that are pushing AI. And I'm like Susan, having an English background at first, I was like, whoa. But as I read more and acclimated more, and as my team as well, we realized, again, this is something that we can use for the good, or we can be afraid of it. So what we did was, we're in a transition. We got a new provost. So working with our provost, she gave the center permission to look at the informal statement based on the research. And then as we came back for the fall, the leadership team did have an advancement session where one of the first speakers talked about AI and the risk and the capabilities of it. So we started forming our statement over the summer. So of course we started revising it and looking at more of an acceptance and putting it back in the hands of the faculty at this moment, since we don't have an official policy or any guidelines. So first and foremost, we're saying educate, come to our trainings, learn more about it. And then also putting it back in the hands of the faculty of being transparent on their views with students about AI and letting them know where they stand with that. We did emphasize, not to use scare tactics or, don't use it in my class, but kind of have an open mind about it at this point, until we all get a better understanding. And I too, like Bill, thinking about the research aspect and the academic integrity and the data protection. All those things are in our statement, and which it is a draft form, but I will give the link so that others can look at it. It is in progress.
Awesome. Dan, where's UNC in the writing program right now?
UNC is accepting AI and looking for ways to integrate it into the mission of the university, I think, really cognizant of these integrity issues. And so, not doing the head in the sand routine, but kind of going in the opposite direction. But at the same time, building in a lot of instructor and unit autonomy. So there are no edicts. If there's a particular unit that wants to ban AI, that would be within their purview. If there's an instructor who feels like they don't want any AI in their class, then they're welcome to specify that. The main thing, again, echoing Wanda, is transparency, or kind of, being really forthright and making sure expectations are clear, whether it's no AI or some AI, and trying to make that really, transparent. And then the writing program is in the same space of, as a program, we are ways to integrate AI into the outcomes and pedagogy that we're putting in place, but also respecting individual instructor wishes in terms of whether or not they want to use AI. And then now looking for the pedagogical opportunities. Are there ways in which it can further thinking rather than replace thinking? How can some of this translate into better awareness of genres, those sorts of things, and looking for those opportunities.
Excellent. Susan?
Yeah, I'll echo some of what Dan shared. Since I came to the University of Arizona in 2015, I have sometimes affectionately, maybe sometimes not so affectionately, but referred to the way that we do things here as kind of the Wild West approach, where everybody kind of does their own thing, and autonomy is very important. At the college level, at the department level, at the instructor level, which sometimes when you're trying to lead a campus-wide initiative can make things a little challenging, or when you're trying to figure out how to respond to an issue such as the development of AI and its impact on teaching and learning in higher ed. But what we have tried to do is to really preserve that autonomy in the way we're addressing things. And it's not just because that's the tradition at U of A. I mean, it is part of the tradition of how things are done, but it's also because it changes so quickly. I think there's a lot of acknowledgement about the fact that we're just kind of scratching the surface of understanding what the capabilities are, what the implications might be. And we're trying to steer, and this is really prevalent, I think, in the statement that came out of our Center for Teaching and Learning. We're really trying to encourage instructors to be very clear about what their guidelines are in their syllabus, and to give students a very clear understanding of why they have the guidelines they do. The challenge, of course, though, is that means that instructors have to understand what AI is and what it can do. And so one of the first things in the set of guidelines that we have from our Center for Teaching and Learning is that you kind of need to play with it. I mean, they say it differently than I am. It's much more eloquent in their language, but you need to understand what it is and what the possibilities are for what you're teaching, for your discipline. For example, this morning I had sent a message to the Associate Dean of our College of Fine Arts because I was trying to think through, okay, what are the implications for music classes, for our visual art classes? Like, what are some of the kinds of things we need to be thinking about? Because I can get locked into my disciplinary lens of thinking about text or writing and not some of the other really important areas that we need to be thinking about. So I think what we're trying to do is to encourage not sort of the knee-jerk reaction of fear and the sky is falling and the end is coming, but instead explore the technology, understand how it works, play around with the back end. And I've often used, maybe it's not a fair analogy, but when I'm speaking with instructors, I often use the analogy of other technologies that have been developed over time that have caused us to question what their impact might be on teaching and learning. And one that I like to pick on a lot is Wikipedia. But the best thing that a lot of instructors could do when Wikipedia first was launched was to try editing things on Wikipedia and to understand the system for how it works. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is to encourage instructors to have a space to play around with that so that they can then articulate what the capabilities are, but also the limitations and what their guidelines are in their classroom based on what the learning goals, what the learning outcomes are.
Bill?
Yeah, I'll try to echo some things that I've done in the role that I played informally, I guess, on my campus, is to try to help stand back and frame the conversation so that we can move towards some outcomes that would be useful. And one way that I think we've been successful, that I don't know if a consensus is probably too strong of a word, but we're moving towards a similar frame of mind, is that we need to develop what I call a culture of consent and disclosure around AI when it's in the loop. Consent would be guided by a horizon value of no illicit use. When AI is involved, we are aware of it. Everyone feels like they can acknowledge it, and nobody's sneaking around or has to feel guilty about it. That's an aspiration that we should get to. When the opposite is true, everyone is feeling a little weird. Are we allowed to use it for our job applications? Can I use it for writing my statement of purpose for graduate school or not? What happens if I do? When the consent arrangements are in place, then the very next question down the line is, what is the disclosure expectations, and what are the conventions for disclosing what AI has done, or how I've used it and how I haven't used it. I think these actually cross over quite nicely into classroom spaces, as well as in professional and research and creative spaces. It's about really being open to the idea of showing your work. So that's the horizon value on the disclosure side, is how is it appropriate to show you what I've done, and what are the best, most efficient ways in any given scenario to show you what I've done, so that we can maintain that culture of trust that writing has always played a part in. Or developing anything, really. Talk about photography or visual images as well. So that's the best way I've found to nutshell that, is we're developing conventions that I think and I hope will solidify into a culture of consent and a culture of disclosure. That consent extends to things like, will my work be used to train a model or not? And I know that's some things, Todd, that you've talked about Adobe is doing, that I'm happy to see. Content provenance, upstream and downstream of AI's interaction with the model. Who gets to decide what material is in there? That's going to affect the outcome. And then if I use an AI model as part of my process, what attribution or ownership issues are down the road? You can imagine that if you're talking about authoring a journal article, that gets complicated pretty quickly when we think about that. And then one other thing I'll mention that I think might be interesting to hear the panel talk about is, this is the kind of cautionary issue that's really in focus for us. And that is, I think there's a real potential with the speed of adoption and the speed that these tools potentially introduce into the creative process, of widening some disparities for people who have barriers to access to these tools. Meaning, it will quickly become obvious who has them and who doesn't. And an example of that in the tenure and promotion process, for example, would be, in 3 to 5 years, what would the publication record of someone look like who is using this versus someone who isn't? we might see a dramatic difference there, and we have to be prepared for that ahead of time, including reasonable and ethical rationales that people may have for opting out of use that will then cause pretty significant differences in what that output looks like in their tenure review. We have to create space for those ethical arguments to matter, and that they don't get overwhelmed by somebody who can go faster using AI without similar kind of ethical boundaries around what they're doing. We are just shy of a meeting in a couple of weeks to start talking about that in a formal way, and it's really the research part of campus, the VP of research, and also the academic HR part of campus kind of figuring out who needs to be in on those conversations about evaluating faculty work, and with and without AI as a kind of factor. But that's just one place where that shows up, that we're keeping our eye on everywhere where there might be a disparity due to speed and pace of adoption and disproportionate access.
And so access and equity is a focal point for everything we do in education, and particularly higher education. And it's interesting because I'm so embedded in my former role as a writing program director. I've only been thinking about undergraduate education, but to hear you talk about, graduate education and faculty, merit and assessment, and the changing nature of that knowledge work they're doing, that's a new lens for me that's really got me thinking about lots of different implications here. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and I've added something to the webpage. And again, this web resource is going to keep unfolding, and I promise you there will be links to everything that everyone's mentioned in this resource. So that's all coming. It will be available within hours of the conclusion of this meeting. To me, this has helped me orient through many moments of change in the project of higher education. That when a new technology enters the space of the classroom, how do we respond to it? And what I want to do in a minute is I want to kind of throw this open to the panel, and first think about the potential advantages, especially for teaching and learning and assessment, that AI brings, and then we'll sort of pause that conversation, and then we'll tease out the limitations or potential disadvantages. And access and equity and bias and misinformation certainly are rife for concerns among those. But I always like to think, this is thinking as a former curriculum administrator that has to frame so much of what we do in terms of an accreditation report, thinking about this outcome, enabling students to become critical, ethical, and agile users of emerging knowledge-making technologies. We've been doing that for a while, and certainly in the writing program at UNC. And it seems more important than ever. And our conversation is certainly going to get into assessment and pedagogical method as we're trying to figure out how to achieve this learning outcome. And I like what Susan just said a minute ago, that you have to open up the hood and start playing with these technologies to really figure out their affordances and limitations, their potential advantages and concerns that they bring up. Obviously, academic integrity is the first thing most people are thinking about, because our higher education institutions have relied so heavily on student writing as an assessment mechanism for trying to first motivate knowledge development, but then to assess the degree to which that's happened. And so in no particular order, let's do a 5-minute, 7-minute brainstorm. What are some of the most promising aspects of the widespread availability of AI technologies across the curriculum for all of our students? And if you want to just raise your hand physically, I can see that, and call on you, and we can just kind of compile a brainstorm a list as we go through around the panelists to see what some of the real exciting possibilities are here. So who'd like to begin? Wanda.
So I'll begin because students are intrigued by it. And if it's something that we can capitalize on their engagement and excitement, why not capture that and produce ways to integrate it into their learning? So for once, again, when Google came out, I've been around a long time. Students were excited. When the internet came out, I was teaching. Students were excited. So capitalize on that excitement. And then, like you said, think tanks like this bring people together to dialogue on the assessment, on the teaching practices, on the activities they can do around using the tools. I was a skeptic at first, I'll be quite honest, and I find it interesting that most skeptics do come from the English humanities areas, and rightly so. We're great writers. So, the fields where writing may not be a big part of what they do, it's a convenience now. It's something that can take one thing off that to-do list that they can get on with their life. So looking at it at both sides and letting the students see both sides and how it can apply to one discipline and maybe not another, I think that's going to be one of the benefits of moving into this culture of consent. I love that, Bill.
Yeah.
So.
Good. Others who are seeing some potential.
Yeah, I can add to that what Wanda said. One that I saw as a member of a different panel where we were talking about the potentials for language learning research, broadly speaking, including languages other than English, is there's a tremendous possibility now to engage in meaningful contextual practice of language in a way that is more immersive and more widely available than we had before. And I think that richness is likely to be broadly beneficial. I think it will. So a great example of that, the folks who make Duolingo, the language learning app that a lot of people turned to in the pandemic to take up some of their spare time by learning a language. He is the head of research for that group, is one of our graduates. So I was talking with him, and they now have a way to create pretty original and non-repetitive scenarios for you to practice, like going to a bakery or a doctor's office in the target language, with a few content seeds to train your prompt, and then some built-in prompts. You can now ask your language training tool to help you practice for a trip that you have coming up to Spain, for example, and to help practice the specific locations and scenarios where you might find yourself in need, like help me practice what it's like to talk in the bus station or something like that. And so I think that there are some really fascinating positive examples for folks who are addicted to learning like I am, to keep the humans learning from what the machine learning enables.
Yeah, Susan.
There are all different kinds of possibilities running through my head, so I'll try to focus in on just two. And one is, and I know I'm thinking like a writing teacher right now, but one of the things that I found really interesting in talking about generative AI with students as a writing teacher is it creates this wonderful opportunity for talking about the importance of rhetorical context when you're writing. When you don't have that context, when something is kind of acontextual, sometimes the results can even be kind of amusing at best. And I'll refer to a story that was shared in a prior webinar, Todd, that you did with Sid and Stacy, when my husband, who teaches writing, was first kind of playing around with ChatGPT. He asked ChatGPT to write a love letter to me, and then he read it to me. And we'll just say it was both like freaky convincing at first, and then it got increasingly laughable because there clearly was no context for our relationship. But it was a really interesting exercise in understanding, okay, well, what can it do? What can it not do? So exploring those boundaries with students, I think, can be really interesting. I'll also share something that a grad student of mine did this summer when he was teaching a tech writing class that he focused on generative AI. And he used it as a way to explore some of the assumptions about different genres of writing in tech writing specifically, but also the kinds of templates that sometimes are useful for us to at least have in mind, even if we end up changing some of those assumptions later on. But playing around with some of that can be really useful for students, and it can kind of demystify some of that process even for them. And I wanted to throw one other thing in there, and I know this isn't necessarily addressing how it's useful for students, but I think new emerging technologies like this are also really useful for instructors, because when we have changes in technology like this or new developing technologies, it really does cause us to take a step back and rethink some of our own assumptions about what our learning outcomes are and why. Like, as I've thought about what are some of the ways that I might use AI productively in some of my classes, I might have students using it to do things that I would have had them do manually before, but that AI can actually do a lot faster. And then instead, I'm like maybe generating an annotated bibliography. But then what I can do is have them spend their time looking through some of these different sources that are compiled, and let's talk about critically engaging with what's relevant and what's not. Why were some of these things pulled? How might you want to narrow your search? And they can see some of those results even faster than they might have in a library database when I was teaching, when I'm teaching it that way. So I think it can help us rethink that, and it can also encourage us to really mindfully engage with the technology too, and think about some of our goals and some of our assumptions.
Dan, what's most encouraging to you at the moment?
I really like what I'm hearing so far, and the idea that the good work that we've already been doing can be furthered in some ways with AI added. So the rhetorical context, rhetorical situations, all of those things. I think writing process also can be facilitated in a great way. I saw Roberta put in the Q&A an item about prompting, and thinking and prompting go hand in hand. So you can teach people some process through some of these things. And then the other thing I think that's really encouraging and somewhat amazing, and right now we're just bracketing all the concerns. We're just thinking about the positive stuff, but the corpuses that have been assembled to do this are pretty impressive. It's crazy that they have access to all of these texts. The corpus that has been put together to make the LLMs work, that's an opportunity in some ways. So if students are in the brainstorming stage and need to know what keywords should I even use, what are the research questions people are thinking about, in many ways there's a lot of knowledge that's been gathered, and it's problematic, but it can be tapped into in these invention stages of writing quite a bit too, I think. So those are really valuable. And then the other thing I think we should look at is, a lot of the opportunities that are created will only translate into advantages if the extension that's necessary happens in some ways. So things like citing your sources, super important, but at some level, if the machine can mechanically move the punctuation or the date from one format to the next, whenever I switch style guides or something, I don't think there's any problem with that. I think it's great. And then what it opens up is an opportunity to ask, why did you use that source? I don't, I want to know what source you used, and I'd like to be able to track it down if I need to. But if the machine does that, then maybe that gives you some time to explain, this source really helped me see this perspective, or it really helped me recognize that there's other kinds of evidence. So this is where I think a long-standing philosophy that people have had who work with education and technology is, as Susan and Bill and Wanda, everyone is saying, you need to know about the tools a little bit too. And if you can somehow get a hand in the tool building even, or figure out, we may not be able to build the tools, but we can build the pedagogy around them. Now that the machine is going to list all these for you, my expectation is for you to show me the thinking then behind that you did for these items. And I've done the same thing with, genres. You can study genres really easily by having AI produce them or AI summarize them. But unless you engage while that's happening and kind of put the intellectual pieces together, then it doesn't really translate into the advantage so much.
Absolutely. So in one of the things that was exciting to me about this was that, as many people in the Q&A pod have said, a deeper and more, let's say, current conversation about assigning writing, designing writing assignments, and assessing those things. And so there's lots of different names for it, writing with genuine rhetorical context, authentic assessment, active learning, as a response to this, and a way to hopefully look at what we're doing in the enterprise of higher education from this new frame to become better at it in some ways. At the same time, my biggest concern is about all of those instructors, and we were actually talking about this just yesterday, out there who are already overwhelmed, under-resourced, who are fatigued with having to integrate and figure out technology upon technology to do what used to be the basic job of teaching a college class. And so let's, obviously the concern about academic integrity is there. What are some of the other things we need to really think about as we integrate these technologies into our classes? What are some of the foremost concerns and things we need to be cautious about?
Do you want us to go into order or just
Any order you want to?
It was mentioned earlier, access and inclusion. Fortunately, when ChatGPT came out as open, it was free mostly. Most of it was. But as these tools get more advanced, the prices may go up and the access for students will be hard. So looking at if this is something we do accept into curriculum development, teaching and learning, assessment, how are we going to make sure that everyone has access? And then I also say identifying the biases of the AI tools, as those become more prominent, making sure that people can distinguish what is biased and what is not.
Absolutely. Dan?
I think I would maybe just restate the question that you posed as a statement of concern, which is the labor involved with, really solid pedagogy, writing instruction. That's never going to go away. And I think there's probably a real danger that people, I don't know who the entities might be that start to suggest otherwise, that, it's possible that we don't need to invest as much labor and energy into the instruction now that these tools are available. And I think that's completely false.
True. The utopia, of course, is that, and this has been the promise of computing forever, right? That these new knowledge-making technologies will free us from the mechanical, the clerical dimensions of doing this work, so we can spend more time on deeper assessment and reflection and rhetorical context. And then we all have faced the realities of the institutional frameworks in which we all operate in terms of the labor to do this, and in making sure that all of our enterprise, or our students in particular, can have relatively equal access to these technologies that we know, historically have created a digital divide. Others who want to comment on particular concerns that we haven't really, explored quite deeply yet.
Yeah, I'll go with I'll put my writing person hat on for maybe the first time. And I think this speaks to both of the two concerns that we've heard so far. It's a little bit more abstract, and that is, I can't think of a precedent in human recorded history where we've had a mechanism that is capable of producing a new standard way of we'll just use English as the example, a new standard English. We know that the establishment of a standard written English doesn't just come with benefits. It comes with some harms. Those harms largely start with exclusion, but they can be much worse. People can weaponize those harms based on the way language norms enact other kinds of access to resources, or maybe even be a vector for violence. What concerns me today isn't that general process. We've lived with that process for a long time. It's just that in the past, it's gone pretty slow. Like, you can watch these sort of let's see, Burke calls them epistemic courts, working to create a standard and then to make that standard exclusionary. And it takes a variety of bureaucratic and sometimes banal forms, like standardized test norms. But there's time to watch it happen, and there's a group of people that you can agitate to perhaps slow them down or complicate things. Now what we have is the potential, for the first time ever, for people to just enforce a standard that's coming out of a model. And it's coming out in a way that we can't really, it's not really tractable, because it's not traceable to one group of people that we can protest. Even the developers and people who release the model don't quite know how it settles on the discursive standards that gets produced. But it could still be enforced and used to exclude nonetheless. We could still today say, in a classroom, for example, on our campus, no less than GPT-3 quality is acceptable for anything you submit. So that would immediately start excluding people, for example, for whom English may not be their first language. And it would lock people into a kind of standard that is not accessible to them without the tool. So what am I specifically worried about? Man, that's fast. And I don't think we've had something that quickly that could become a hegemonic power based on language standards in our midst. So that does keep me up at night a little bit.
Absolutely. And so, Dan, I think I remember seeing part of the writing program statement that you produced. Top of the list is concerns about bias, about, Bill just gave a great example of the English language itself, but it's all kinds of bias, the potential for misinformation, the replication of bad ideas, that, because it's written in what appears to be a standard language form, seems legitimate by the way it sounds. And so in everyone's work on these policy statements and these guidelines, how prevalent were these concerns in conversations about these somewhat terrifying potential results?
I think that's been the starting place. People jump to plagiarism right away, academic integrity, then they quickly land on bias and misinformation. I think that's really valuable, that that's foremost on people's minds. But as we all know, there's so much that becomes invisible as it becomes common practice, as Bill was just mentioning. That and there's a kind of like magician sensibility that AI operates under. When the text just starts typing itself on screen, it has this sense of authority, and it's, that's great. That looks like a good sentence. It's better than I could write. Suddenly, I'll take it. And you put those concerns off to the side a little bit. Then the other one that, is important to me is what are humans really good at? That, we kind of are eliding these distinctions between humans and machines. And I think that's something that I've tried to pay attention to is, and it goes somewhat to Bill's point too, especially in terms of academics, what are the values of interaction and connection that we have as humans that we want to put forward. So something like empathy, spontaneity, ability to scale and change perspectives quickly. Those are wonderful things that humans are really good at, that these machines are not trained to do and not good at all. So we elide those differences and make a mistake. And I'm sad to say this, but I was thinking of your concern, Bill, when I ended up talking about how a lot of universities, the ones with large scale, for years have been processing applications. The essays that come in often get machine scored on a first pass, and the machines, for years have been good enough to spot the grammar errors and kick people out. So it's not a absolutely new phenomenon, but yeah, I don't have a closing point there.
All right, Susan, any concerns we didn't touch on?
I'm just loving some of the thoughts that are coming out in this conversation, and I think maybe the concern that it highlights for me is how limited our thinking sometimes is and what the implications are, both positive and negative. Because I was looking at the different statements that I mentioned that had been developed at the University of Arizona, and the very first one that came out really just focused on ChatGPT. And it was kind of addressing this one particular technology that had emerged and was getting a lot of media attention. But even in some of the subsequent work that's been done, there's a lot of focus on academic integrity, a lot of focus on maybe preventative measures, like how do you design writing assignments or other kinds of assignments so that they're process-based, and how do you, but you could certainly ask AI to write a reflection for you too. It's not like you can't do that. But I think as long as we are continuing, and I'm using that we very generically, but as long as in higher ed, we continue to focus on what students know and not how they know it, or how they think, or how they are engaging, how they communicate, or how they make the choices that they make, but just what they know, the facts that they know. Something like AI is a very immediate threat, certainly. And my hope is that I see it start to shift our focus of attention a little bit more towards focusing on how students know what they know, how they understand, how they learn, instead of just memorizing facts or memorizing rules and templates. And so that's, I don't know if that's really a definitive answer about the concern, but
it's amazing. But we're at the top of the hour and we want to respect everyone's time. Incredibly grateful to the panelists for sharing their thoughts and their experiences. As promised, we will take as many of the statements and guidelines that were referenced today, and we will make them accessible to you through this webpage here at this URL. And so thanks everyone for being here today. This is just the beginning of a conversation. The next Digital Literacy Cafe on September 27th is actually going to talk about specific lesson plans for enacting the kinds of principles and ideas that we talked about today. And the third Digital Literacy Cafe of the fall on November 8th is going to get to the specific idea about how, right now in higher education, we're mostly focused on large language models for text and writing, but what about images and video? And a number of you in the Q&A pod were asking questions about that. And that will be the specific focus on November 8th. I thank everyone so much for being here and being a part of this. This resource we will keep adding to and building on so that it becomes robust and helpful and useful. I encourage you to tune in for the next cafe on the 27th and November 8th. And again, thank you so much to my four colleagues, friends, and co-panelists, and for sharing their really insightful and important ideas with us today. Thanks everyone for being here. So long.